Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku had the Transmutation Quirk, Deku X Mayhatsum, Part 1. So before we start, please go check out the author of this fanfic, Volatile Pyromaniac. Link is in the description. Also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. Slam. A boy with a mop of blonde, unruly hair found himself smacking against the hard surface, bouncing off, and skidding against the concrete. The boy barely had time to feel tears well up in his eyes before he felt callous appendages wrapping themselves around his throat. A rough hand hoisting him up from his previous position on the sidewalk. Red eyes widened, a choking and gurgling noise coming from one Katsuki Bakugo's throat, as he attempted to desperately suck oxygen into his burning lungs. The impact had knocked the wind out of him, and with the hand wrapped around his throat, cutting off his air, he found his lungs to be desperately craving something he could no longer attain. The person who had picked up the child was still only a child himself, a boy around 12 with midnight raven hair, an angular face, and an averagely built body. "Where the freak do you think you're going, brat?" he questioned aggressively, his hand tightening further around the young Bakugo's throat. Instead of panic, or fear in the blonde boy's eyes, the black-haired offender only saw anger, those eyes quickly narrowing, and an aggressive growl escaping the blonde's throat. Distinctly, they both heard a small, panic scream of Kaken. The older boy paid it no mind, but Bakugo quickly became angrier. He could handle this, but his timid best friend, Midoriya Izuku, couldn't. He didn't want his friend in the world of pain he was currently in. He raised both his hands up, aiming them at the offender's face. He flailed them madly in a desperate attempt to get himself free. His struggles only seemed to amuse the older boy, who laughed at his pathetic attempts. The blonde didn't know what overtook him. He raised a hand towards the black-haired boy's face, his hand deathly still, as he let out a loud scream. Die! The sweat on his palms bubbled for a fraction of a second before violently exploding. Although the explosion didn't cause any severe damage to the older boy, the shock and the flash of light had been enough to concuss him, making him drop the blonde boy onto the floor, gripping his stinging eyes. Kaken! He heard that damn scream again, and the thudding of footsteps only got louder. He tilted his head back, watching his best friend sprint at his offender, his arm having changed, growing metallic, and gaining a texture that is only seen on rebar. The 4-year-old Midoriya slammed into the person who had assaulted his best friend, his hardened hand impacting painfully against the attacker's liver, and making him double over in pain. "Let's go!" Izuku shouted at Bakugo, motioning for him in a panicked manner. Stunned not only by his display of a quirk, but by Izuku's as well, it took him a minute to respond, but he quickly got to his feet, and the two boys quickly ran off before the older boy could recover. It had taken them a few minutes, but the pair eventually found their way to Izuku's home. They had not stopped running, terrified of the older boy catching up to them. The moment that adrenaline stopped coursing through their young veins, the pair crumpled, bending over, and wheezed desperately in an attempt to catch their breath. A few moments later, their labored breathing had slowed considerably, and Izuku was the first of them to break the silence. "Kaken, your quirk manifested!" the curly-haired boy shouted with unrestrained excitement, his voice filled with glee for his friend. The blonde's chest puffed up in no small amount of pride, grinning at Izuku. "PSH, yours did too. And you're the one that managed to knock him on his ass." Midoriya paused, staring at his friend with a sense of awe. "I did?" Bakugo merely rolled his eyes. Who would have thought that Deku, the biggest hero fanboy in existence, would not realize that he had finally taken the first step to achieve his dream, manifest his quirk. "Look at your arm, dumbass," he said, mirth filling his tone. Midoriya looked down, and sure enough, his arm had undergone a very noticeable change. Flesh and bone had disappeared, replaced with heavy, rugged rebar. Almost his entire arm had changed, the transformation to the heavy rod of steel reaching just beneath his elbow. Even his fingers had undergone the change, he noticed, his joints and ligaments replaced with swiveling metal. He tried moving his fingers, and the metal creaked in protest. His fingers responded sluggishly, as the metal curled at a slow rate. A look of shell-shock crossed Izuku's face. He had done it, he had manifested his quirk. He swiveled around sharply, adrenaline once again coursing through his veins. As he rushed up the steps, his friend momentarily forgotten. As he slammed his hand against the door, metal thudding against the wooden surface, as he excitedly and erratically knocked. Midoriya Inko opened the door not a moment later. A green-haired woman that was nearing her 30s, the woman looking quite annoyed with whoever had disturbed her peace. Her eyes widened, as she took in the form of her son, his metallic hands still outstretched. She slammed into him, wrapping him into a tight embrace, as tears of joy streamed down her pristine white skin. "My baby," she squealed, "you did it! I did it!" The young Izuku squealed happily, and Inko hoisted her boy up into the air, hugging him tightly against her chest. His own tears of joy began to seep out of his green eyes. She raised him up into the air, giving him a wide grin, sniffling softly, as tears still softly trickled down her features. "You know what that means, Izuku?" she uttered playfully. "I'm going to be a hero," he squealed once again in response, and she hugged him close to her chest once again. Bakugo gave a deadpan stare. Man, the Midoriyas were a bunch of freaking crybabies even then though. He still couldn't help but feel warmth and happiness fill his chest at the prospect of him and his best friend growing together, and fighting alongside one another, becoming the top heroes of their generation. He turned around slowly, careful not to interrupt the moment between the mother and child, as he walked away. The rest of the day went by like a blur for the young Midoriya. He didn't know how, or when it happened, but he eventually found himself seated on the couch, still admiring his metallic arm. As he waited for his mother to finish cooking dinner, the delicious smell of katsudon wafted through the room, and kept the young boy eagerly bouncing in place. For some reason, the young boy felt that he was hungrier than usual, like he hadn't eaten in days. It only made him all the more eager to enjoy his favorite meal. He didn't know when it happened, but eventually the novelty of having his quirk had worn off. He stared at the hand, his green eyes no longer filled with awe, but with curiosity. He flexed his fingers once again, noting how they shifted uncomfortably unnaturally in their transformed state, metal grinding against metal making for a low squeaking sound, as he moved his joints if they could even be called that anymore. "Mom?" the young boy called out, uncertainty filling his voice. "Yes, honey?" His mother's voice rang out, loud, and as sweet as ever. "How do I turn it off?" he questioned. That's simple, honey. She paused momentarily, then cursed under her breath. How did he turn it off? Well, it looked like it was time to make a visit to the quirk doctor. Izuku had to go get his quirk registered anyway. And so, after a filling dinner, the pair found themselves in a doctor's office. An overweight, friendly-looking man with a bushy mustache and a shaved head staring curiously at the small boy. Izuku was sitting in an oversized swiveling chair, and his mother stood by idly for support. The quirk doctor leaned in closely to inspect the metallic arm of the young boy. "Well," the doctor started, "it's certainly a unique quirk, that's for sure," he stated. "Usually, transformation or, as you probably know them, body enhancement type quirks don't usually manifest so strongly, especially not at such a young age," he uttered, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Izuku blushed at the praise, and his mother beamed at the doctor. His hand reached for a small clipboard laying atop his desk. The doctor peered over it once more. He hummed. "His quirk factor is rather high, which could explain how strongly it manifested, but from what I see, it's more than just a simple hardening quirk. Those require constant concentration to maintain. You seem to require that only at the preliminary stages. Say, my boy, what did you feel when you activated your quirk? What exactly did you think of?" Izuku fiddled nervously in his chair, idly scratching at his metallic hand. "I just wanted to be tough enough to defend Kaken." He tilted an eyebrow at the name, but didn't comment on it, simply letting the boy continue. "I was looking around, and I saw a piece of metal lying around. It was the toughest thing I could see, and I was wishing that I could be that tough." He quirked a brow once again. Strong emotional experiences were what it usually took to trigger a quirk, or cause it to manifest. But for the boy to manifest his quirk in a way that resembled something around him? Oh, it was much more than an ordinary hardening quirk, that was for sure. The doctor had a small hunch, and he'd have to test it to be sure. He simply had to sate his curiosity. Sure, he saw quirks of all kinds on a daily basis, but such a strong quirk manifestation in a 4-year-old boy? It was simply unheard of. Unless, of course, hardening, or simple body enhancement wasn't his quirk at all. "Izuku," he started softly, and pointed at a nearby medical bed. More specifically, he had pointed towards the metallic railings that had made up the metallic base that supported the bed. "I want you to look at that, and think of the exact thing you thought while you were saving your friend, okay?" he uttered, and locked his gaze onto the boy. Izuku nodded quickly, and with not a small amount of excitement. He gazed at the metallic railings carefully, taking in how they looked, how smooth the stainless steel surface was, and its rough diameter. He sucked in a deep breath, and surely enough the very tips of his fingers on his untransformed hand began to glow. The doctor sucked in a large breath, as he saw the boy's fingertips transform right before his eyes, flesh and bone disappearing, giving way to hard metal. The boy didn't get very far with his transformation, as he had barely managed to transform his fingers to the first knuckle before the glowing stopped, and Izuku leaned forward, his breathing heavy and shallow. The older man gently grabbed hold of Izuku's hand, using his free hand to lift off his greenish goggles, so he could take a better look at the transformed digit. "Amazing," he spoke out faintly, before managing to collect his composure. "Young man, your quirk it is." And then suddenly, Midoriya Inko, who had kept quiet for most of the appointment, made her presence known. "Transmutation," she blurted out suddenly, making Izuku jump in his seat, and giving the doctor quite a startle. The man gave her an inquisitive look, his gaze simply begging for an explanation from the woman. She blushed deeply, now embarrassed by her sudden outburst. His quirk is transmutation. When his curious eyes didn't relent, she explained further. He can change his body's composition, transforming or transmuting it into whatever he desires, as long as he knows the chemical composition and the rough dimensions. The doctor gave her a blank look. And how do you know this exactly? Her cheeks reddened further, but she still spoke. Well, it was my husband's quirk, she uttered softly, as her eyes took on a nostalgic tone. Izuku looked at his mother in amazement, while the older man simply gave her a deadpan stare. And why didn't you mention any of this in the first place? He said, annoyance clear in his tone, as he pinched the bridge of his nose. It didn't. She paused, trying to look for the right words to describe her point. My husband couldn't use it in the same way that Izuku had. The doctor nodded, and she continued. He had to focus if he wanted to maintain the transformation, which is why he never got really far with it. But Izuku doesn't have to. That's why I thought a different enhancement quirk had mutated in him. He wasn't born with his arm looking like this, so it couldn't be a mutation quirk either. His eyes widened with a sense of curiosity. How do you know so much about quirks? My husband was biting down on her bottom lip nervously. He used to research quirks quite a bit, and when you spend so long around somebody like that, you sort of pick some things up, she said with a nervous chuckle. Why didn't you simply show the boy to your husband then? He asked, with genuine curiosity filling his tone. The doctor quickly cleared his throat when he saw the distant, hurt look in both of their eyes. Never mind, he said swiftly. Now, Izuku, he said, his tone filling with mirth and warmth once again. Since we now know what your quirk is, and we have a name for it, I think we're done here, he said, ruffling the boy's green curly hair. But doctor, the freckled boy whined, I don't know how to turn it off. Oh, well, in most cases with enhancement-type quirks, you simply have to relax your body and stop concentrating on that one spot. But since your case is so unique, I'm going to wager that something so simple won't work. Try the opposite of what you had to do to manifest. So think about the fact that you're safe now, or that your task has been completed. Izuku breathed in sharply, and closed his eyes, following what the doctor told him. With a bright glow, the metallic appendages had swiftly transmuted back to flesh and skin, almost instantly. In fact, the doctor smiled, settling the green goggles back over his eyes, staring, as both Midoriyas had their chests puffed with pride, as they slowly, but confidently strode their way out of his office. He sighed deeply, as he sat back into his chair. Amazing quirk, strange kid. I'm sure I'll see plenty of him in the future. He trailed off, before leaning a hand over his intercom, finger hovering right over the button that would send in his next patient. He stopped just short of pressing the button, his hand instead moving to grasp the clipboard once again. He swiftly produced a pen, jotting a few small notes at the bottom of the page. He'd have to ask the receptionist to mail this to the Midoriya family. However small a role he could play, he wanted to help the child grow. The boy was brought to him from the moment he could speak, and ever since then, Izuku had wanted to be a hero. It might have been too early to tell, but the sheer determination, the sheer will in his eyes, Izuku would grow to accomplish great things, that much he was sure of. A small blonde boy found himself at the familiar front steps of his friend's home. He jumped up the steps quickly, as he did every day, and practically slammed his fist against the door, abusing the wooden barrier that had kept his friend from him. Coming, he heard a feminine voice call out, and not a few seconds later, the door opened to reveal a disheveled-looking Inko, her hair looking much more messy than usual. The stained apron around her waist told Bakugo that he had probably pulled the woman away while she was cooking breakfast. Her face brightened upon seeing the small boy. Hey, Baku-chan, she smiled warmly, leaning over and ruffling his hair. He didn't allow anybody to touch his hair or invade his comfort zone. Not even his relatives got away with that. But Inko Basin simply radiates warmth, everything from the kind smile on her face, to the way she gently, but affectionately held him. It made him feel nice. He'd let her touch him, he decided, but only this one time. Of course, he made the same decision every single day, but that's besides the point. Izuku-chan is inside, she exclaimed, her voice carrying the same warmth that her smile held. Her bright smile was suddenly replaced with worry, as she started to fuss over the small boy. Are you hungry? She questioned. I was just in the middle of making breakfast. Was he hungry? Yes. He was so excited about the fact of playing together with Izuku using their quirks that he had completely forgotten all about breakfast. Was he about to tell her though? Hell no. I already ate. He lied, and she didn't believe him one bit. Bakugo, she said, disappointment marrying her voice. He sighed, and spoke through gritted teeth. Fine. Immediately, her expression of worry was wiped away, replaced with a happy, mirthful smile. Come on in. Well, Bakugo decided inwardly, Izuku looks like death. The small boy had deep, dark bags under both of his eyes. His hair was more of a mess than normal, and he looked pale, unusually so. Not to mention, he seemed to be staring off into the distance, his eyes unfocused and hazy. Bakugo could even swear that he looked thinner than he was yesterday. "What happened to you?" he asked in a blunt manner. "Oh," Izuku's eyes lit up in recognition. "Hey Kaken, I've literally been staring at you for the last 5 minutes hoping that you'd notice me." "What happened?" "Well, since I manifested my quirk yesterday, I had been trying all night to summon it, but it takes ages just to get my fingertips transformed, and even then it takes a lot out of me. So I went online and started researching quirks and the different things that they do, particularly enhancement quirks, and how they work. It helped me a little bit, but it didn't make that much of a difference. I could only do it slightly faster, and it seemed to be faster the more I did it. But it takes a lot of energy, and I feel really hungry, and it's going to take a while before I eat." "Nerd," Bakugo cut him off, anger dancing in his crimson eyes. Izuku promptly stopped. "You're mumbling again." Izuku blushed in response. Even the redness of his cheeks seemed to be rather pale. He raised a hand to his hair, scratching at it sheepishly. "Sorry, you know how I get it." "Repeat, slower," Katsuki demanded. "I spent all night trying to practice my quirk, and didn't sleep." Bakugo threw both of his hands in the air in frustration. "Why couldn't you say that in the first place?" Didn't you?" Izuku stuttered. "Didn't I?" Bakugo snapped. "Practice your quirk." "No? And you want to be a hero? Idiot." "What did you say, DKU? You can't be a hero without practice, Bakugio." "I'll show you, DKU." He extended his palm out, aiming it in Izuku's direction, and immediately, the sweat on his palms began to bubble. Izuku immediately extended a fist in front of him, the tips of his fingers beginning to glow. "Boys, breakfast is ready," shouted Inko from the kitchen, immediately causing both boys to halt, as their stomachs growled in unison. They both narrowed their eyes at each other, and each extended an accusing finger. Later, they both hissed, and swiftly made their way to the kitchen. A few years later, he could feel his heart beating harshly in his chest, as he was inched closer, and closer to his destination. His veins throbbed painfully in his neck. As eager as he was, Izuku was also very nervous. His birthday presents were never required this much preparation, but his mother deemed it appropriate to blindfold him before leading him to his present, which meant that it was probably something very special. He resisted the urge to raise a hand up and rip the black fabric away from his eyes, but he didn't want to anger his mother. After all, she had insisted on him wearing it. Inko had led him only a few steps from the living room before he accidentally slammed his foot against something. A wooden step. His excitement, however, far outweighed the pain, and he flinched so much as flinch. His mother let out a hurried apology, excitement still palpable in her tone even as she tried to seem as apologetic as possible. She was probably just as excited as he was. He was led up the steps with minimal incidents afterwards, and a few moments later, he felt his mother's grip tighten on his shoulder. He halted in his tracks. He heard the distinctive sound of metal clicking against metal, a sound he had grown quite accustomed to from practicing and working on his quirks so often. He heard his mother fumble with what he only assumed were keys. His hunch was quickly proven correct, as he heard the click of a door being unlocked. His mother pushed on his shoulder again, and he was hurriedly pushed inside the room. He heard his mother suck in a deep breath, before the blindfold was all but yanked from his young eyes. Before him lay what could only be called a treasure trove to the young Midoriya. It was a medium-sized room, one which he had never entered before. There was a large, mahogany desk on the opposite side of the room, the desk still lined with papers, books, and a few notebooks. A well-decorated fountain pen, and a small metallic ink holder that had dried long ago. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls of the room. There were 4 in total. The 2 on the right-hand side were filled with books of all shapes and sizes, while the ones on the left-hand side were lined with small notebooks. The room hadn't been used in many years, but still held a pristine sheen to it. His mother had, after all, religiously cleaned and upheld the room even in his father's absence. However, he had never examined the contents of the room itself. The green-haired boy hurried over, curious to see just what his father had lined his shelves with. Much to his surprise and his excitement, the books were all related to a singular subject: quirks. Izuku's eyes were practically glowing as he gazed over the titles of the books. Quirk theory, quirks, and biology were some of the ones he first laid eyes on. They looked fairly new, and he quickly saw some older, leather-bound books that had to be decades old. Quirks, the first major step in human evolution. He could barely contain his excitement, bouncing in place as he went to the mahogany desk, picking up the small stack of notebooks that were atop it, and flipping through the titles. Quirk theory and quirk analysis number 32 were at the very top of the stack. He squealed in glee. That was just like his hero analysis notebooks. A warmth flooded through his chest as he realized he had inherited some of his father's traits. His mother didn't mention his father often, only that he worked somewhere far and safe. She had likened him to his father on more than one occasion, claiming that he had inherited not only his father's eyes, but his analytical skills and his intelligence as well. He shook his head before that train of thought went on for any longer. His father was a touchy subject for him. He focused on the notebooks once more. Some of them had all-encompassing titles like Enhancement Quirks No. 9, but some quirks were notable, or even complex enough to get their notebook. He found only 4 such examples on the stack that had occupied his father's desk. The first notebook was titled Quirk, Void. Young Green eyes widened at that, his mind drifting through all the possibilities of what a quirk like that could do. The second one was labeled Quirk, One for All. He chuckled at that. Its name was rather cheesy, but noble, almost something like his favorite hero All Might would exclaim. He would definitely have to give that one a read later, he decided. The third was simply called Quirk, Creation. Izuku blanched. If that quirk did what he thought it did, then he was a little bit jealous. He was tempted to flip that one open right then and there, but the notebook right beneath it had gotten his attention. It read Quirk, Transmutation his Quirk. He grinned in excitement, turning to his mother and giving her a bright smile. She returned his grin as she saw the title of the notebook. Happy 8th birthday, Izuku-chan, she said happily, as tears began to form in her eyes. He turned to his mother, practically leaping at her, and enveloping her in the tightest hug his young frame could muster. After a few minutes of hugging and crying, they were Midoriya's. After all, his mother had decided to leave him alone in his father's study, and the boy moved to the large, black leather chair with a bounce in his step. He slipped into it carefully, the notebook being tightly hugged to his chest. As he did so, he softly laid the notebook on the surface of the mahogany desk. He handled the notebook as carefully as he could, treating it as if it would shatter if he happened to simply brush against it too harshly. With a gentle finger, he flipped the notebook open, quickly glancing over and beginning to read the first page of the book. The very center of the first line simply reads, Transmutation. Izuku paused briefly, admiring just how unique his father's handwriting seemed to be. It wasn't like the flowing, smooth kanji his mother practically drew on the pages, gliding her hand along effortlessly, in a rhythmic flow. Nor was it like his own, hurried scribbles, any beauty being ignored in favor of fast and efficient note-taking. His father's calligraphy was simple. It was the only way to describe it, almost robotic. In fact, it seemed that every kanji letter had been printed on, but it wasn't. He could see the small imperfections that dotted the notebook, a streak from the fountain pen running out of ink, a few droplets of dark liquid smearing the page after a hasty refill. Almost instinctively, he could pick up the small flaws and analyze them like no one else could. He blushed, embarrassed. Even with those small faults, his father's handwriting was polished to near perfection, a far cry from his own hurried scribbles, understandable to only his own eyes. Origin: an offshoot of the quirk creation of the Yayorozu bloodline, conceived when a male with the creation quirk had intermingled with a female with the quirk hue shift. Izuku's eyes gleamed, while he breathed out softly. So his father was a Yayorozu? It was certainly an interesting revelation, but he could somewhat see it, understand it. The Yayorozu were as renowned for their intelligence as they were for their vast wealth. The young boy knew about them, of course. His obsession with heroes and quirks alike had made sure of that. While certainly not a lot of the Yayorozu bloodline had opted to become heroes, but the ones that did stuck out as some of the very best, being indispensable in both combat and rescue situations. It filled him with a certain sense of pride, knowing that he belonged to a family of heroes. The quirk hue shift allowed the user to shift minor things about their appearance, mostly limited to the color of the hair, eyes, nails, and skin. The quirk also requires constant focus and metabolization to maintain. The quirks manage to mutate and merge together in the offspring, limiting the effect of creation to the user's own body, with the downside of needing constant focus being inherited. The green-haired boy's eyebrows curled up curiously. Something didn't sound right. He didn't have to focus on maintaining his quirk. He only had to when he was transmuting a part of his body. Maybe his quirk had mutated. It was very unlikely, but it wasn't impossible. Quirks mutated and got better as they passed from generation to generation, growing more complex and more difficult to control in the process. The Yayorozu family and the Todoroki family were proof of that. Long ago, the famous creation quirk had been limited to creating hunks of unrefined ore from the body. The Todoroki family came from similarly humble beginnings. It was hard to imagine that Endeavor's quirk had mutated from a simple fire-breathing quirk 6 or so generations ago. But quirk evolution took time, and it wasn't like his quirk had evolved completely differently from his father's. It was more like a different version of the same power. He broke his train of thought, choosing to press on with reading. Details. Transmutation allows the user to transform their own body into anything they desire, but much like the originating quirk, creation, the transformation is limited to non-organic material. That made sense, Izuku thought. At least he wouldn't have to worry about accidentally growing a second head. The quirk, also much like creation, requires the user to know the exact chemical makeup of an object to be able to transmute it. He knew that much already. After all, he had spent countless nights reading up on the composition of different materials, mostly metals, and experimenting with his ability to transmute. This re-engineers the body's fat cells, consuming them in the process, and requires constant focus and metabolism to maintain. Izuku perked up. There were some obvious differences between his father's quirk and his own, but they were essentially the same power. It seemed that he was going to have to make a few notes of his own, but he dared not ruin his father's well-organized, neatly written notebook with his own messy, rushed kanji. Instead, the young boy slipped out of the leather chair and hurriedly skipped out of the room. He dashed back a few moments later, a plain notebook in one hand and an All Might pencil in the other. His hand was shaking as he extended the pencil towards the cover, but for once, he wasn't shaking from fear or nervousness, he was shaking from excitement. He brought the graphite tip of the pencil against the cover paper and began to slowly and carefully write out the title of his own quirk analysis notebook, Transmutation, version 2. He decided that it would be a fitting title. It was simple, yet effective, at least to his 8-year-old mind. Before he began scribbling his notes in the fresh notebook, he picked up his father's book once more, picking up where he left off. The transmutation process consumes more time and more energy the more complex the object is, taking up to a few seconds for a complex creation. The time it takes to transmute an appendage is not too noteworthy, but could work against the user's benefit if suddenly confronted with combat. The green-haired boy frowned. That was yet another difference that he noticed almost immediately. His father took seconds to transmute something complex, while it took him minutes and most of his energy to simply transmute one of his arms into hard metal. Sure, it stayed that way when it was done, and he didn't need to dwell on it any further after that, but he was still jealous of his father's efficiency and speed. Another difference I have to write down, he mumbled to himself absent-mindedly. The Transmutation Quirk is quite versatile, allowing the user to mimic other quirks, copying their abilities in a more mechanized fashion. A speed-enhancing quirk could be mimicked by integrating a booster into an appendage, and likewise, a hardening quirk could be mimicked by transmuting metal subdermally, allowing the skin to be much harder than it normally is. Izuku's gaze turned curious. Hardening? Like the pro-hero, Crimson Riot? He already knew how useful hardening a limb could be. It wasn't only a boost of defensive abilities, but offensive ones, as well. But to limit the hardening to the skin? He wanted to smack himself for not thinking of that, and to think that he had his quirk for nearly 4 years. The green-haired boy raised his hand up to his face, and then promptly shut his eyes, focusing intensely. A few splotches of shiny, silver metal started appearing at the center of his palms. They looked like droplets of spilled ink, standing out against his tanned skin. His eyes fluttered open after a few moments, a wide grin crossing his young features. He pulled his other arm upwards, and started flicking the small spots he had managed to transmute. His grin only got wider, as he heard the distinctive clicking of metal. It was sloppy, and a bit slow, but it was a start. He was sure that once he mastered it, it would be a much faster way to reinforce his arms. It wouldn't be as solid as changing the entire thing into metal, but he figured it could be done in a pinch. Wait, if he could use his quirk's abilities to mimic other quirks. Did that mean he could mimic Kaken's quirk? The only thing he had to do was figure out the chemical composition of nitroglycerin, and with enough practice, he could probably turn his sweat into nitroglycerin the same way that Katsuki did. Sure, he wouldn't be able to ignite it at will, but it would be a start, and he was sure he could figure out a workaround with enough time. Izuku's eyes scanned further down the page, a bit disappointed to see that the analysis had already ended. So soon? That was what, 2 pages? If that was all there was to the quirk, then what possibly made his father use up an entire notebook for this? Now curious, the boy gripped the notebook in his hands and began flipping through the pages. Much to his surprise and amazement, each page he had flipped through showed a different illustration, a well-polished sketch, hand-drawn with a title above it, and a short description beneath it. The green-haired boy's eyes bulged. The notebook had 100 pages, and practically all of them were filled with some sort of sketch. He flipped to the very center of the notebook, curious to see what exactly these sketches were. Quirk Mimic, Air Cannon, the title read, and the sketch showed off the cross-section of a mechanized arm, filled with all sorts of different compartments, with a long, thick, metallic tube going through the very center of the arm, and jutting out of the palm. His father had even scrawled in rough dimensions, and the material for each component. He swallowed. That was a little advanced for him, he had to admit. Just transmuting his arm into solid metal took a lot out of him. And he had already been shown that he couldn't fine-tune the dimensions of his transmutation, as he had barely managed to transform a few patches of skin, let alone an entire arm, filled with moving parts. And were those tiny gaps he saw lining the sides of the arm? But still, just the prospect of him being able to eventually achieve something like that made him bounce eagerly in his seat once again. His father had to be extremely creative and smart to be able to come up with so many ideas for such a quirk. He flipped through the notebook again, trying to find something simpler, something that would get him started in following his father's footsteps. A year later, green eyes fluttered open at the incessant ringing of an alarm. The curly-haired boy yawned, softly sliding a hand over to the button and stopping the annoying beeping that had woken him. He smiled to himself, sitting up and stretching his arms over his head with a loud but cheerful groan. He twisted his body, naked soles finding themselves impacting soundlessly against wooden flooring as the boy practically skipped out of his bed. Energy filled him from the moment he opened his eyes. Izuku followed a fairly simple morning routine. He'd wake up, take a quick shower, brush his teeth, eat a large, healthy meal that his mother prepared, and then he'd go out, find Katsuki, and the pair would go for a run together before they headed out for school. Convincing Katsuki to exercise wasn't an easy task, but somehow, the young boy had managed to convince his blonde friend about the importance of exercise when it came to developing their quirks. He had only discovered the importance of physical training about 8 or so months ago, when he read through one of his father's many notebooks about enhancing quirks. Apparently, the best way to maintain enhancement quirks was to exercise regularly and have a proper diet so that the quirk had plenty of reserves to draw upon. He woke up expecting the day to be like any other day, but instead of the smell of a delicious breakfast wafting through his room, he only heard an eerie silence. That wasn't right. His mother was up before him nearly every day, and if she wasn't cooking, then she was usually cleaning around the house, or vacuuming. He tilted his head curiously, trying to listen for something, for anything that would indicate his mother's presence. Silence. Having inherited his mother's worrywart nature, he immediately expected the worst, and he dashed out of his room, his morning routine all but forgotten. As he went to look for his mother, he checked the kitchen first. Nothing. Everything had remained untouched. Even the dirty dishes from last night's Katsudan dinner had been left unhandled. The living room? Also nothing. Not quite worried, he rushed back upstairs, bursting through the door of his mother's room. He found her. Her face was buried deep into a pillow, and her frame was shaking, her shoulders bouncing quietly. Her fingers were clutching the pillow so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she had yet to respond to his presence. Only when his beating heart calmed down he realized what she was doing. His mother was crying, sobbing weakly into the pillow. "And Mom?" he asked weakly, taking a hesitant step forward towards his prone mother. She didn't answer. "Mom?" he practically shouted, his feet moving instinctually, his hand moving to grasp her frame. She jolted, quite startled. She looked up at him, her eyes puffy and red from all the crying, and her nose runny. Seeing him must have awakened something, because soon enough, tears started running down her face once again. Izuku, she choked out, spreading her arms and motioning for him to come closer. He immediately found himself in the arms of his mother, Inko hugging him, as tight as she could, almost as if he would disappear any second. "Mom, what happened?" Her tears spilled that much faster, and she buried her face in his chest, beginning to sob loudly once again. He could barely pick up the words that she sputtered out in between the sobs that racked his mother's frame. "Your father," she stuttered out, and sobbed that much harder against him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, cold goosebumps beginning to creep all over his young frame. "What?" She pulled away from his chest to momentarily look up at him, her bloodshot eyes taking a moment to focus on his own green orbs. She clenched her teeth, sniffling softly before speaking. "Izu-chan," she started softly, wiping away her tears, and then gripping him by the shoulders so he would look at her. "Your father," her voice cracked momentarily. "He's in a coma," she spoke softly, each syllable she forced out causing a stabbing pain in her heart. He only had vague recollections of the man that he had called his father. All that remained of him were hazy memories, broken recollections of a mysterious man that had long ago disappeared. There was one memory in particular that he had clung to. He was young, maybe 3 years old or so, bouncing excitedly in his father's lap, his mother's laughter echoing throughout the room. He remembered kindness, warmness emanating from the man, even if the details and the structure of his face had been lost to time. He felt as if something had punched a hole through his heart. "We don't know if he's going to make it." Izuku maintained his wide-eyed stare, shock, and confusion on his face. "What happened?" he asked again, his voice cracking just like his mother's voice had not a moment ago. He trailed off, biting down on her bottom lip, tears welling up in her eyes again. Guilt pooled up in her eyes. She couldn't keep the secret from him, not any longer. He was fighting a hero, and he lost. The hurt expression in the boy's eyes hurt his mother deeply, and the faint tears prickling at the edge of his vision made her own rise to the surface again. "Why?" he asked, clearly hurt. Why had a hero taken his father from him? What had his father possibly done to warrant such an attack? Inko visibly choked up from his question. She could barely formulate words. She knew what was coming would possibly break her son. But he had to know, the truth couldn't be kept to him, not when he was now beginning to mature. "He's a villain," she uttered, Izuku's blood ran cold. It didn't make any sense. The man his mother had spoken so fondly of? A villain. The man who had given him life? A villain. The man who he admired and hoped to be like? A villain. The words echoed throughout his head like a mantra. Villain. He had spent countless hours obsessing over this man's research and quirk analysis. This villain's research. His quirk? The quirk of a villain. The thought made him sick. It disgusted Izuku to know that he had been born with villainous blood in his veins. His mind rushed through a plethora of different emotions, sadness, rejection, but mostly anger. He was angry at his father for so many things, but mostly he was angry at himself. To obsess and chase behind the shadow of a villain when he called All Might his idol? He shook his head bitterly. It had been a few weeks since his mother broke the news, and he hadn't stepped in his father's study since then. Of course, he had already gotten most of the use out of that room out of his father's notebooks. He had memorized each of his father's in-depth transmutations, everything from telescoping limbs to the advanced air cannon he had stumbled upon. Of course, he didn't have the precise control that was required to transmute most of the sketches in that notebook. And now, with the latest revelation about his father, he didn't think he wanted to. He wanted to distance himself, as far as possible, from that man, that villain. In his efforts, he found himself standing outside a fairly sized gadget shop that catered to heroes. The sign, constructed with a bright, neon pink glow-red Hatsum's babies. He had figured out the fact that he could, in theory, copy gadgets only a few months prior. But he had completely ignored that idea in favor of obsessively studying from his father's notebooks. Why did he need to copy gadgets when he had what was essentially a mechanical encyclopedia at home? Izuku steadied himself with a deep breath, and he pushed the door open. Immediately, he was greeted with a loud, chirpy tone. "Welcome to Hatsum's baby," she practically sang, and Izuku's eyes immediately went to hers. She was a middle-aged woman, about his mother's age. The way she looked was interesting. She had bright pink hair, almost matching the neon sign outside in its intensity. It was in a moderate state of dishevelment, as was the rest of her outfit. A set of deep brown goggles decorated her forehead. A much too cheery smile was etched onto her face, and her yellow irises were looking at Izuku with a large amount of interest. She absent-mindedly moved a hand across her abdomen, smoothing out the heavy-looking blacksmith apron she had on. Izuku blushed nervously under her intense stare, shyly moving himself towards the counter, his trademark red sneakers shuffling together awkwardly. "Hi," he stuttered out. He had mostly squashed out the habit of stuttering, but meeting new people still made the green-haired boy nervous. "Welcome," the woman chirped cheerily again, motioning him to come closer. "So, how can I help you? Are you, He paused, looking up at her expectantly. "The owner?" She practically sang yes, "and the main gadget creator here," she announced proudly, her chest puffing up in pride. He shook his head, and his head craned down to his feet, the boy brushing his red sneakers together a bit awkwardly. "Are you looking for any assistance?" he suddenly blurted out, the smallest bit of stutter beginning his sentence. That, she didn't expect, as evidenced by the fact her eyebrows rose so high that they seemed to go past her goggles. Hatsum Aiko wasn't really expecting anything like that out of the boy. Children were a rare sight in her shop, and most of the ones that came in just wanted to see the cool gadgets she made. Not that there was anything wrong with that. She happily and proudly sated their curiosity every time. But for a boy that looked younger than her daughter to ask to assist her around the shop? She wanted to say yes, but doubt quickly plagued her mind. Why did he want to help her exactly? Children, as young as him, except her own daughter of course, were rarely interested in the process of manufacturing support items, and even less aspired to create said support items. So, what had driven the child to come to her? Why? She asked simply, genuine curiosity, and a hint of shock filling her tone. Izuku, being the bright boy that he was, understood the question quickly. "Why should I let you?" I began, trying to formulate the proper response that would get her to agree to mentor him in creating gadgets. Seeing as he couldn't come up with one though, he let out an exasperated sigh, and simply held his arm up high, his palm clear in her view. Swiftly, the tips of his fingers began to glow, and the look of curiosity that occupied the pink-haired woman's face turned into fascination, her pupils dilating and shrinking as she stared at what she only assumed to be an enhancement quirk. It took a few minutes of straining, but not once had the woman broken her gaze away from his hand, staring at it intently, as he slowly but surely transmuted the appendage. What stood before Aiko was it was still a hand, but flesh and skin had disappeared, instead being replaced with shiny, silver metal. It wasn't a simple enhancement quirk. She could see it, as her quirk allowed her to zoom in and take in the intricate details of the transformation. The dimensions of his fingers had changed ever so slightly. His knuckles and his joints, however, changed completely, being replaced with metallic joints, complete with moving components. The boy seemed to move his mechanical fingers as naturally as he moved his human ones. A large grin crossed her face, It's my quirk, he muttered, blushing under her intense gaze. I can transform my body into anything mechanical, as long as I know how it's made, he explained simply, and the euphoric look in the older woman's eyes scared him a little bit. Was this a mistake? Hatsume's mind was rushing through hundreds of thoughts. She squealed, the possibilities, she yelled internally. If his quirk worked like she assumed, she was going to have a lot of fun with him. He already showed a good understanding of mechanics, so she wouldn't have to teach him that. They needed to get started right away. Ome was going to have a field day with him. He was practically the perfect subject for gadget experimentation. Her head snapped around so fast that Izuku thought she had broken her neck. May, she yelled out to the back of the shop. What she got in response was an explosion, a rather loud explosion, and a plume of smoke shooting out of the small door that led to the back room. Coming, he heard a young voice call back. A few seconds later, a girl his age came out of the room, covered from head to toe in soot, and dear God, was her hair on fire. The miniature version of the Hatsume woman quickly brushed a hand to her hair, putting out the beginnings of a fire brewing atop her head. She giggled to herself, slipping the goggles up off her eyes, and gazing intensely at Izuku. Aiko turned back around, waving a hand towards his direction. Meet your new partner! The girl squealed just like her mother had, and ran up to him. She had practically thrown herself at him, wrapping firm arms around his frame. Hello, new best friend, she exclaimed loudly, excitement palpable in her tone. Izuku smiled to himself, as he had his breath squeezed out of his chest from the force of the hug. Well, this didn't go as bad as he expected. The following day, Izuku wheezed softly, as he attempted to push himself off the floor once more, his forearms and biceps burning painfully as he performed his 20th push-up. He failed to lift himself completely off the floor, and collapsed in a small heap. Even with his failure, he still felt a sense of pride filling his chest. A few months prior, he could do no more than 2 before collapsing, and now, he could do almost 10 times that amount. It had been slow, but he knew he was improving. Exercise, he found out, was a very important part of maintaining his quirk, and that wasn't only limited to running. He had to get core muscles stronger, his arms stronger, and his legs stronger, as well. It hadn't been apparent in the beginning, but the transmutation of flesh to metal came with the added weight he needed to carry. He hadn't noticed at first, only being capable of small patches of skin, or his whole hand if he had a lot of free time on his hands. It was only when he began experimenting with sturdier, denser metals he realized that he actually had to carry that weight around, especially if he was going to start using his quirk like he desired. Izuku let out a small sigh. He needed to stop mumbling, and trailing off, he had almost missed breakfast. He didn't want Katsuki to be pissed at him again because he was a few minutes late to what had become a routine run in the morning. He quickly ran down the steps, jumping down the last 2 steps, the delicious smell of his mother's breakfast luring him to the kitchen like it did every day. His mother had prepared what could only be described as a feast. She had been making those ever since she had gotten the doctor's note about his increased metabolism. How Izuku had to maintain a higher caloric intake than his peers to keep his quirk's use efficient. Ever since then, his mother went all out with breakfasts. Boiled eggs, grilled fish, a large amount of vegetables, and a healthy bowl of rice had been his normal breakfast for a few years now, and surprisingly, he finished all of it, almost every single day. The doctor was right. Ever since he had started those large, healthy breakfasts, his transmutation speed had gotten faster, and his creations were more solid than before. He quickly stepped into his trademark red sneakers, and gave his mother a small kiss on the forehead before he headed outside. She gave him a loving smile, and handed him 2 water bottles, a large one that was filled to the brim with icy water, and another smaller one that was filled to the brim with raw honey. Yes, honey. Somehow, his mother had found that stuffing his lunch bag with a bottle full of honey had kept those random dizzy spells that he had before at bay. Apparently, his blood sugar got low often, and he needed to constantly keep it topped off by drinking raw honey. Yes, a lot of other people thought that he was insane when he brought a water bottle filled with honey to school, but he couldn't help it. His use of his quirk was practically constant. If he wasn't actively trying to practice with it, then he was passively changing his skin to metal, reverting it back, and then transmuting it back to metal underneath his long-sleeved school uniform. He wanted the process of transmutation to be as easy to him as breathing, and it was certainly becoming that way from the intensive way he threw himself into practicing it. In a way, he was a bit jealous of Katsuki. His quirk was really simple to use. He only had to oxidize his sweat, and bam, explosions. It wasn't that it was just simple to use, it was really powerful too, and all he had to do to use it was to sweat. It was a little bit unfair, in Izuku's mind. That coupled with the fact that Katsuki had already figured out that he could use his explosions to launch himself short distances. It made Izuku a tiny bit jealous. The boy was 9, and he was able to use it not only offensively, but defensively, as well. He had helped Katsuki come up with stun grenade, A weak explosive blast that caused a bright flash of light, and blinded his enemies for a few short moments. He could do all that, and Izuku was damn near sure he hadn't actively pursued training his quirk once. It was already perfect, as he said. Meanwhile, Izuku practiced his quirk all day, every day, and all he had to show for it so far was a slow transmutation. He could make his entire arm robotic, and he had a tiny bit of progress with turning his skin metallic, but that was about it. For all the progress that he had made, he still had quite a way to go. But he'd do it, he was determined. He wanted to be a hero, and nothing would stop him. Even with the blood of a villain in his veins, he was going to show everyone that he could be a hero. 3 years later, handsome Aiko barely flinched, as the sound of a loud explosion rang throughout her shop. Her ears began to ring, and she shook her head, an expression of faint annoyance crossing her features. "You two okay back there?" she yelled, casually flipping through a small gadget magazine that laid atop the counter. She didn't even bother to glance back to see the plume of smoke. She had gotten used to it by now. "Yeah," shouted the pair in unison, a series of muffled coughs coming from the small back area of the shop. The cause of the explosion? May had insisted on overcharging a speed enhancement gadget, a fairly sized gadget that clipped around the calves, and used bursts of compressed air to give the user a small boost in speed. May had come up with the ingenious idea of using another type of compressed gas, nitrous oxide. She hadn't even given Izuku time to react before she had inserted a small, finger-sized canister into where the compressed oxygen usually went, and then set it off. The gadget, only meant to release oxygen, couldn't handle the sudden heat of introducing such a flammable substance, and spontaneously combusted. "You're an idiot," bristled Izuku with a small sigh, a gloved hand moving to scrape away the soot that had accumulated on the heavy red goggles he wore. The pink-haired girl answered him with her usual overexcited grin, small wipers moving frantically from side to side to wipe away at the soot that had accumulated on her own brown goggles. She let out a loud, boisterous laugh before wrapping an arm around Izuku's shoulder, and pulling him close. "We would have never known if we hadn't tried." Izuku looked outraged. "Yes, we could have," he shouted back, opening his mouth once again to argue before May's fingers shushed him quickly. "No arguing," she said in a sing-song tone. "We have more babies to make," she said with glee, tossing Izuku a metallic wrist strap. He caught it swiftly, his metallic hand clinging softly against the steel device. "What now? Are we going to shove a stick of dynamite in this?" he uttered sarcastically, and he saw her yellow irises roll. "No, idiot, I need you to adjust this," she said, her grin never once leaving her face. His brows furrowed, and he grumbled under his breath before the tip of his index finger began to glow. May watched on in fascination. No matter how many times she had watched him transmute his hands, it never stopped intriguing her. Even if she had seen it hundreds, if not thousands of times. The tip of his finger stopped growing, his transmutation narrowing down his finger to a fine rod, with a screwdriver at the very end. Wordlessly, he began adjusting the metal bracer, feeling the pink-haired girl's hand patting his shoulder affectionately. "Good toolbox," she sang, knowing that that particular nickname annoyed him to no end. As much as May got on his nerves, and she did it often, he could honestly say she had become one of his best friends, and an invaluable partner over the years. The pair spent a few more hours tinkering with, thankfully, no more incidents. Izuku's theoretical knowledge, and constant research, coupled with May's creativity, and hands-on experience made them quite the productive pair. A few years ago, Izuku could barely hold a gadget properly. Now he had the expertise to properly deconstruct, and then reconstruct any of the gadgets in Hatsume's shop in just a few short minutes. He still didn't have enough experience for Aiko to allow him to repair the broken, or damaged gadgets that pro heroes brought in, but she was kind enough to give him an in-depth explanation about each and every mechanical part, and how to repair it if it was damaged. Time usually passed quickly whenever he and May worked together, and today was no exception before either of them realized Aiko was closing down the shop, and Izuku sadly had to bid the mother and daughter pair farewell before he left. The following day, two boys stood on opposite ends of a fairly large-sized tatami mat, an elderly man standing between them, grasping a large, well-used bow staff in his hand. The man was dressed in a traditional, loose-fitting kimono, the threads as black as his piercing eyes. His head didn't hold a single lock of hair, but the man more than made up for it with the thick beard that dangled from his chin, coming to a point right past his collar. He toyed with the hairs of his beard thoughtfully, glancing between the blonde and the green-haired boy. Seeing each of them tense their body in readiness for combat, he quickly tapped the bow staff on the floor once, and then stepped back, watching the pair with an experienced, analytical eye. Katsuki lunged forward, going into a full-on sprint to close the distance between them. Izuku simply made a few strides towards the center, knowing full well that the blonde would come at him in the same way he had every time the pair fought. He sidestepped the right overhead fist that came his way, and responded with an open palm strike to Katsuki's stomach. The blonde didn't, as much, as flinch, spinning around his axis, and quickly performing a roundhouse kick that stung Izuku's palms, as he blocked it, his body being lurched backwards from the impact of the strike. True to his nature, Katsuki stepped forward once again. Before Izuku could so much as recover, he spun around again, using the spinning to gain momentum. As he aimed another roundhouse kick at Izuku's face, instead of blocking like he had before, he instead tilted his body backwards, a leg quickly moving, and sweeping Katsuki's leg from beneath him. He cursed, as Katsuki landed on his hands, and launched himself backwards with a small roll. The pair grinned at one another, as they each took their respective stances, sidestepping slowly, as they moved around each other in a circle. Surprisingly, it was Izuku who took the initiative this time. He moved forward, and jumped. Taking a note out of Katsuki's book, he spun around his axis, and delivered a painful roundhouse kick directly to the blonde's face. Katsuki had been so surprised that Deku out of all people took the initiative to attack that he had completely forgotten to block or move out of the way. He watched in fascination, as Izuku's heel slammed into his cheek, and sent him barreling towards the floor. Their old mentor let out a small whistle at the boldness of that move, also surprised at the fact that it had worked. Freaking nerd. Katsuki growled out loudly. He leaned back so that all of his weight was focused on his back, before lurching his body forward, and kipping up. Even though his cheek stung, and his vision was still swimming, he still lunged forward after all. He had an amazing amount of pain tolerance from using his quirk. He aimed a right overhead strike at Izuku once again, and the green-haired boy shifted his stance, ready to redirect his attack, and knock him off balance. But Katsuki hadn't gone through with the attack all the way. As soon as Izuku had shifted his stance, the blonde shifted as well. He kept his left foot firmly planted on the floor, and then spun around his body, delivering a devastating spinning elbow to the green-haired boy's unprotected cheek. The amount of force from that attack sent him to the floor. He hadn't been knocked out, but it was damn close. Black spots filled his vision, his world beginning to swim around him. His vision swam so badly that he hadn't noticed the light tap of the bow's staff that had concluded their spar. Looking up, Izuku saw Katsuki unsteadily moving on his feet, his knees buckling beneath his own weight before he, just like Izuku, collapsed to the floor, holding his bruised cheek. A small laugh caught both of their attention. An amused smile had been dancing on their mentor's face. But more than that, they saw the pride that filled his eyes, as he stared at the pair. "You're getting better," he commented, amusement still in his tone. "Midoriya," he started, "your defensive style is still a bit too rigid, but you've made good progress. Try not to analyze every single movement. Let your muscle memory do the fighting for you." He had repeated that remark dozens, if not hundreds of times by now. Izuku lightly blushed, and rubbed at his green curly locks sheepishly. "And that was a nice hit. It's good to see you've finally gotten daring enough to take the first strike." He smiled under the praise, a goofy smile playing at Izuku's lips even, as his mentor turned towards Katsuki. "And you idiot," Katsuki responded with a death glare, though it was quite subdued. He knew their old mentor was quirkless. It didn't make him any less intimidating though. He could still beat both their asses with a hand tied behind his back. Literally, he had done it before. "How many times am I going to have to tell you to slow down?" he uttered, affection and annoyance littering his tone. "Take your time, think. Your speed makes you unpredictable, but it also leaves you with a lot of openings." Katsuki begrudgingly nodded. He, much like Izuku, had heard this particular comment before, and he was trying to work on it, honestly. But it was hard to slow down and think when he was such an adrenaline junkie. He tapped his bow staff against the floor, and the pair quickly rose to their feet again, each clutching their respective bruised cheek. Almost in perfect unison, they each shook their heads, and took their respective fighting stances once more. Later that day, Bakugo Mitsuki wasn't alarmed when she heard her son let out a series of curses obscene enough to make a sailor blush. It was a usual event in the Bakugo household, after all. What did surprise her, however, was the fact that he hadn't blown anything up afterwards. Now that got her brow raised. Her gaze was still locked onto the TV. The woman too caught up in watching her favorite late-night soap opera to really bother with checking out what was wrong. Her eye lazily turned to the clock during a slow moment of the episode, and immediately, her brow began twitching. What in the ever-loving freak had caused her son to start shouting at 1:30 in the freaking morning? That little shit better not have started sleep-talking. The last thing she needed was to wake up at 3 in the morning to her son screaming about murdering sheep in his sleep. She fumed. Had he woken Izuku too? The boy was staying over. The vein on her forehead only bulged that much larger when she realized the boy probably woke up his father. The last thing that her husband needed was Katsuki shouting his ears off while he had a long day of work ahead. She slipped off of the couch, slipping on her favorite pair of pink, fuzzy slippers, and angrily starting to make her way to her son's room. Her television left blaring, and forgotten. Angrily, she stomped her way up the steps, her feet thudding loudly against the wooden paneling. If Katsuki didn't wake his father up, she was sure that she was going to, by this point. She raised a slipper-covered foot up and then kicked her son's door open with a resounding slam. She opened her mouth to shout curses at her son as she usually did, but just how focused he seemed to be seemed to throw her off guard. Katsuki was occupying himself with a pencil and a sketchbook, and seeing, as they had All Might plastered all over them, they were probably Izuku's. She watched, as her son angrily scribbled something, and then tore the page from the notebook, shoving it in Izuku's face. Only when the green-haired boy pointed towards her direction did Katsuki finally notice his mother had barged in. A vein bulged in his forehead, and he turned to her. "The freak why you want, old HAG." He threw his hands out in front of him, pointing to the massive mound of crumpled-up papers and 2 notebooks that read hero costume. "Oh, so the little shits were making their hero costumes, eh?" Mitsuki couldn't help but feel somewhat excited at the prospect. She had watched for many years as her son spoke about becoming a hero with religious zeal, and now that becoming a hero was finally in reach, he was developing an outfit. She wanted to squeal in glee and asked to see their designs, but she also had to be a mother. Freak, being an adult sucked. "Well, keep it the freak down," she shouted back at him, promptly turned around and slammed the door shut, only to open it a second later and peek her head in. "And show me what you came up with when you're done." Both boys gave her a wide grin and a nod. She quickly and quietly, this time shut the door once more. "A belt strapped with grenades?" Izuku asked incuriously, before his brow furrowed a little bit in thought. "That wouldn't be all that bad, actually. You could actually use those grenades as storage devices to store your sweat if you hook up the belt with some sort of vacuum or pump system. One that injects all the different grenades with sweat, and it'd pull a lot of unused nitroglycerin from your chest area, an area which you don't use all that mumbling," Katsuki yelled, interrupting him. Izuku sighed. "I'm saying it can work, with some adjustments." Katsuki grinned. "So you're saying I'm right? Kind of? Eat shit, Deku. Freak you, Kaken." "The freak did you just say?" he yelled out loud, getting in Izuku's face, challenging him. "The freak did I just say?" Mitsuki's angry voice came from outside the room, and Katsuki let out a huff of annoyance before grabbing his notebook once again. "So, what about the grenade gauntlets?" he asked hopefully. Izuku deadpanned. "That's just stupid and impractical." The green-haired boy shot a hand up. "It's not a bad idea," he started. "But instead of storing all your sweat in one place and blowing it in one go, why not give yourself more shots to work with?" "I'm listening." "So," he grabbed the notebook out of Katsuki's hand, drawing a thin line beneath the spot that Katsuki had scrawled out the design of a massive grenade that wrapped around his hand like a gauntlet. Beneath it, Izuku began to draw out a gauntlet that wrapped around the hand, going all the way up to the elbow. It seemed rather bare, and Katsuki was about to interject until Izuku started sketching out what looked like a miniature rocket right next to it. "This," he pointed towards the storage device, "goes onto your gauntlet." He tapped his base drawing once again. "I can probably fit up to 5 of these on your gauntlet at a time, making 10 shots, he explained. "These will fill up with your sweat as you fight, and you can either," he pointed to the tip of the miniature rocket, "uncork them, and use that sweat to form a powerful close-range attack." Katsuki seemed pleased at that aspect of the design. "Or," he began, and pointed towards the bottom of the miniature rockets, "you can launch these off your gauntlet and make for a huge long-range explosion." Katsuki choked. That sounded freaking amazing. Man, having a nerd for a friend is freaking awesome. The blonde grinned. Izuku smiled under the praise and flipped through his friend's notebook once again, finding different things that he could improve upon. What began as "let's work on hero costumes together" ended as a massive nerd tries to cram as many gadgets into a costume as he can. It wasn't until dim sunlight had begun to permeate throughout the room that pair had finished their illustrations, each one promptly collapsing into a crumpled heap onto the floor, not even bothering to get into a comfortable position before sleep overtook them. They had taken 12 hours? But they were finally done, and had a result they were happy with. 2 years later, Izuku was distracted. A rough, calloused hand wrapped carefully around a pencil, moving in slow, careful strokes, as he sketched out yet another design for a transmutation. He had mastered the process a few months ago, able to now perfectly transmute each and every design he came up with. He had practiced religiously with his different transmutations, mastering a plethora of designs. His proudest achievement? A transmutation he called Boost, a mimicry he had designed off of the pro-hero Ingenium's quirk. Instead of the boosters being near his triceps, however, he had positioned them much lower, near his calves, offering a more natural and more controllable burst of speed. It was loosely based on a gadget that May had blown up a few years back, one of many. He had also discovered that he was able to transmute foreign, non-organic objects. The discovery was admittedly accidental. He had been focusing on the sketch of a gadget so thoroughly that he hadn't noticed he was subconsciously channeling his quirk. He had only noticed when the pencil in his hand became a steel tube, and had torn a large chunk out of the page he was sketching on. He hadn't gone anywhere with the discovery, he simply didn't have the necessary power to do so. Transmuting his body had become easy due to his own familiarity with it. Transmuting his arms now took little out of him, his legs took out a little bit more, but he could do it. But transmuting something, as small as a pencil, would drain him of nearly his entire energy stores. He had a few theories why, but none of them stuck out as particularly plausible. Simply put, his ability to transmute other, non-living objects was an enigma to him, and he didn't even attempt to practice due to just how ridiculous of an energy requirement it took. He was so distracted with his train of thought that he hadn't noticed the teacher call out his name, nor the general state of uproar that the class seemed to be in. A small explosion snapped him out of his trail of thought. He gave a sideways glare to Katsuki, who returned his gaze with a full-on murderous expression. "Stop freaking mumbling, nerd." Oh, he was thinking out loud again. Oops. He heard small snickers, and laughter echoed throughout the small classroom, followed up with an even bigger explosion. Katsuki had slammed his hands down on the desk, a small explosion covering the desk in burn marks, as he yelled, "Shut the freak up, extras." The mood sobered very quickly. Each one of their classmates looked up at Katsuki with a fearful gaze. "Laugh all you want, extras, but none of you here are as strong as we are," he exclaimed, loud and proud. It was true, during their time and training together, the pair had shown considerable growth. Quite literally, Izuku was now sitting just an inch above 6 feet tall while Katsuki was merely 2 inches below that. Izuku attributed that to a lack of a healthy diet, and the blonde didn't take exercising as seriously as Izuku had. Katsuki didn't really need it much for his quirk, after all. Surprisingly, the green-haired boy spoke. "We both aced UA's mock exam," he stated simply. "While you freakers did freakity-freak all." That was Katsuki. Why didn't the teacher step in? Oh right. He was just as deathly afraid of Katsuki as the rest of the class was. The pair silently fist-bumped, a knowing grin crossing each other's faces. They had trained their entire lives for this point. There was nothing that was going to stop them from achieving their dreams. The green-haired boy shuffled along, his red sneakers moving noisily, thudding against the asphalt, as he made his way home. Much like every single day, the boy was distracted, his young brain moving through one idea through another. How to improve his transmutations, how he could build some things quicker, new metal alloys to experiment with. He had been so distracted that he hadn't noticed the manhole shuddering beneath his foot as he moved across a small underpass. He did notice, however, when the manhole was launched upwards, slamming against the top of the underpass and creating a large crack in the concrete. It landed not a moment later, and the deathly silence after put Izuku on edge. He immediately raised both of his hands up, taking a defensive fighting stance, as he stared at the entrance to the sewer expectantly. There was no time to transmute his hands into anything complex, so he just settled with hardening his skin. A void-like black formed at the very edge of his fingertips, and quickly spread down, moving through his arms like a raging fire. The black metal didn't stop. The creeping transmutation took less than a few seconds, and stopped just beneath his biceps. He had been wholly unprepared for what came to him next. What he could only describe as a massive amount of faded green, rancid sludge shot out from the manhole like a geyser, and it was quickly starting to move his way. He did the only thing he could. He turned around and ran, adrenaline filling his veins and fueling his muscles. Unfortunately for him, as much as he was overexerting himself, he wasn't fast enough. A large blob of that disgusting sludge slammed against the base of his neck and knocked him off his feet, making him roll against the asphalt painfully. Small cuts and friction burns littering his face as he attempted to get on his feet and make a run for it again. He didn't move. A heavy weight had been placed on his back, and he realized that whatever that thing was, it was atop him, holding him still. He heard a loud, booming laugh, an insane crackle coming from that mess of liquid. Finally, a fitting vessel. Don't struggle. It'll only take a minute. Before he could do as much as react, he felt a wave of liquid rush against his face, prying his lips open, and beginning to push down his mouth. He choked out loudly, gargling, as he was forced to swallow down mouthful after mouthful of that rancid liquid. It invaded his nostrils. He couldn't breathe. His lungs burned. Was this the end? Was this the way he died? A budding flame extinguished before it could grow to what it was meant to be. He struggled, his hands clawing at his face before the mass of sludge had pinned his arms down too. Different emotions coursed through him: fear, anger, desperation, and finally, acceptance. Tears began to flow freely from his eyes. Everything he had done had all amounted to nothing. All the training, all those hard hours slaving away, strengthening his body, and his quirk, pointless. Midoriya Izuku was nothing more than useless. "I'm sorry, Mom." His eyes fluttered shut, as the very last of his oxygen was forced out of his lungs. This was it. This was his end. Smash! Then the world around him exploded. He didn't know what happened exactly, but he knew that one moment the life was leaving his body, and the next, he had been slammed against the concrete wall, bruised, in pain, but breathing. He was alive! He opened his eyes, expecting to see the horrifying visage of the sludge villain charging at him yet again, only to be met with a large, confident, and reassuring grin. What stared back at him could only be described as a Herculean man, standing well over 7 feet in length, and with a body that was so muscled it looked like it had been carved out of stone. Izuku knew that trademark grin, and those spiky locks of deep yellow from anywhere. It was the hero that he had looked up to for all his life, the number one hero, and the symbol of peace, All Might. Izuku nearly had an aneurysm. All he sputtered out loud, looking at the mountain of a man that stood proudly before him. The tall man responded with a confident, reassuring laugh, slipping into a pose. Might. It's alright now. Why? Because I am here. The catchphrase that he had heard 1,000 times before seemed to reverberate within the boy. All Might, he exclaimed loudly, promptly getting to his feet. Being saved by his hero, he felt a strange weight make its way onto his shoulders, a burden that he had experienced before, one that he had squashed away, bottled up. He felt filthy, tainted, before the symbol of justice and heroism before him. He was the son of a villain, and before him was the number one hero. His thoughts moved like tumultuous waves, doubt once again plaguing his mind. Izuku had thought that he had squashed those thoughts away, that he could become a hero no matter what. He had charged on with a headstrong mindset, an unrelenting determination. But before All Might, for some reason, he felt pressured, uncertain. He needed confirmation, validation, something to let him know he could become a hero. Well, All Might started, bending his knees. Since you seem to be doing alright, young man, I'll be off to hand this villain off to the local authorities. And with that, he took off, a large, spiderweb-like crack emanating from where he had launched himself. Izuku resisted the urge to let out a horrified scream, as he stared down, the buildings beneath him moving away in a blur. They were going so fast. All Might, he shouted out, his words coming out like a warbled mess thanks to the wind moving his lips around comically. The blond man glanced down, panic filling his features, as he noticed the boy attached to him. With no other choice, he was forced to land on a nearby building. Izuku looked down in shame, unable to meet his hero's gaze, as he spoke, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. All Might, do you think I can become a hero? He was met with another boisterous laugh. Of course, he exclaimed, and quickly turned, hoping to be able to leave the building before his time ran out. Luck didn't seem to be on his side, however, as the boy before him silently shook, before whispering out, even if my father is a villain? All Might paused, jolting suddenly, as he coughed blood into his hand, and his muscle form deflated, leaving behind a thin, sickly-looking man. What did you say, young man? My father is a villain, he screamed out, tears forming at the edge of his eyes, holding himself from sobbing openly in front of his hero. The sickly man paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his features for a few moments. Does everybody know about this, young man? Izuku softly shook his head. Only me, and my mother. And I, as well, All Might said thoughtfully, looking at the kneeling boy, who seemed to be quite shaken. Izuku recoiled, as he felt a thin, reaffirming hand grasp his shoulder softly, giving it a few pats. Don't worry, young man. All of his fears seemed to melt away into nothing. That doubt that plagued him, and made his heart thump uncomfortably in his chest, it was gone. Izuku glanced upwards, hoping to fill his eyes. Who are you? All Might's face fell. He let out another bloody cough, before he explained what happened to him to the young boy. How he had gotten injured, and how time, as a hero, was extremely limited because of that. After a lengthy explanation, All Might squeezed his shoulder once again. Don't worry about your lineage, young man, he said softly, a bright, confident smile. No matter whose son you are, you can be a hero, as long as you're determined. And now, both of us have a secret we have to keep, he said with a playful smile, raising a thin, lanky finger to his lips in a shushing motion. Izuku smiled, and wiped the tears from his eyes, as he thanked All Might, watching the man disappear behind the small door. Neither of them had noticed that the bottle that the villain was captured in had gone missing during the exchange. Izuku grinned, as he saw a bright flash of light, followed up by the sound of a booming explosion. There was no way in hell that was an accident. That was most likely a villain attack, and where there were villains, there were heroes. As much as he had grown, at his very core, the boy was still as obsessed with heroes as he was when he was young, and before he could, as much, call his mother, he found himself excitedly gravitating towards the source of that small explosion. His brisk walk turned into a rapid sprint, as the loud booms of explosions filled the cityscape. It seemed like a powerful villain, seeing that fight was going to be so exciting. His excited pace stopped promptly, as he came to the alleyway where the explosions were coming from, a cold chill creeping up his spine, and freezing him in place, as he saw what was before him. It was the sludge villain, the very same one that had attacked him not a few minutes earlier, and it seemed to be wrapped around a civilian. Dear God, was that Katsuki? Another chill ran through his spine, as he recounted the day's events, realizing that he had knocked the bottle out of All Might's pocket sometime during their impromptu meeting. He looked around, panicked, desperate, but the heroes all around seemed to be standing in place, trying to keep the civilians from intervening, but not much more. Kamui Woods, Death Arms, even Mount Lady was simply standing in place, watching in as much horror as he did. The only hero that was doing something was simply trying to control the fires that had been caused by Katsuki's explosions. A wave of nausea hit him, as he realized the blonde was probably in as much panic as he was not a few minutes earlier, and the explosions were probably purely reflexive. Kamui Woods couldn't do anything, those explosions would burn him alive. Death Arms couldn't do anything either, physical attacks would phase right through the sludge villain. Mount Lady, she could probably grab Katsuki, and somehow shake off the slime villain if she tried. No, the alley was too small for her to even step close. He ground his teeth together, trying to think of a solution. The only thing he could do was to blow that thing away, like All Might had. What could he do? A single thought rang across his mind, a schematic, he remembered it, as clear as day. Quirk mimicry, air cannon. He had sworn not to use his father's transmutations, but now, there was no other way to save his friend from certain death. Before he had even formulated a plan, his body moved, adrenaline flowing through his veins, as he began to channel energy to right hand. A rough idea of a transmutation going through his mind. He was sure that he could blow away the villain with the air cannon, but transmuting that required time. He needed something to buy him time, and he couldn't simply wait. Katsuki's struggle was getting more frantic, and he was sure that he was running out of air. As he ran forward, his right arm began narrowing beneath the elbow, the skin taking on a bright metallic sheen, as his hand narrowed further and further, turning into a spear point, his right arm being transmuted into what was essentially an iron spike. His sprint brought him to the creature in a few milliseconds, but he couldn't get close enough. Katsuki's flailing was still causing harsh explosions. Throwing caution to the wind, he hardened his skin, and charged forward. He attacked the only weak point he could see, the eyes. He hurriedly plunged the spike that had been transmuted from his arm into the creature's left eye. He heard a horrific cry, and then a sharp inhale of air. Katsuki had been freed momentarily, allowing to only get a mouthful of oxygen before he was recaptured again. But that was enough. It would buy him enough time. The long sleeve was torn to shreds, as the arm transmuted beneath it, the constant shifting of metal beneath it tearing it to shreds in a matter of moments. He stepped back, raising his left arm upwards, his appendage having become completely mechanical, a large hole now gaping in the center of Izuku's palm. The metallic parts were still clicking into place and reconfiguring as he raised his arm. Rectangular holes began to open up along the sides of his arm, a sharp whistling coming from the appendage, the air around his distorting visible, as it was sucked in and compressed in the arm. He charged in once more. He cancelled the transmutation of his right hand, hardening it, and plunging it into the sludge villain's body, grabbing hold of Katsuki's hand. Smash! It was the only word that came to mind, as he slammed his hand forward and released the compressed air. The repercussions had been so powerful that it had launched the villain away, his body turning into a collection of splatters against the opposing wall of the alleyway. The recoil had launched the pair against the wall, bones slamming against brick painfully, as Izuku impacted against the wall, the arm he had used to save his friend being bent back at an awkward angle. Katsuki landed against him, and the last thing that Izuku saw before his vision went black was the visage of All Might's muscle form stepping between them, and the sludge villain that was slowly beginning to reform. Waking up was a process, a slow and very painful process. He had drifted in and out of consciousness multiple times. Sometimes he didn't even get to open his eyes before sleep overtook him again, and the realm of unconsciousness embraced him like an old friend. But finally, after what seemed like hundreds of tries, his eyes finally fluttered open, expecting to find the familiar All Might decorated surroundings of his room. But instead, what stared back at him was an overwhelming amount of pale white. Everything from the bedsheets to the walls, to the ceiling, to even the cast on his hand was white. Wait, what? When had he broken his arm? He stared, glaring at the hard material that was wrapped around his appendage, as he tried to recollect his admittedly extremely hazy memories. It was his mother who first noticed his awoken state, as he heard a soft yelp of Izuku. Even his mother's demure voice felt overwhelming to his ears. It was only then that he became aware of the constant whir of machines and the incessant beeping around him. He blinked, his head moving sluggishly to meet the sound of his mother's voice. He saw her hunched over the bed, blinking away tears, as she leaned in and very gently hugged him. It was unlike the bone-crushing hugs he liked to receive, but even that soft contact caused his bones to creak in protest. His mother let go quickly after noticing his small whine of pain. "What happened?" he wheezed out, just noticing how dry his throat felt. His mother immediately gripped a cup of water that was on a small stand next to the bed, and carefully positioned it against his lips. Sending her a grateful look, he opened his lips, and started taking small gulps of the liquid. His stomach felt full before he even finished half of the white plastic cup, but he felt so parched he didn't really care, and finished the entire thing. He softly cleared his throat, looking up at his mother once again, and asking the same question. "What happened?" He was pleased with the fact that his voice didn't crack. She gave him a sad smile. Her voice cracked, clearly unable to handle the pain of seeing her child in such a condition. "Hurt yourself when you saved Katsuki?" "Ah," he wheezed softly, looking at his surroundings once more, his mother watching on in silence, seemingly pleased that he was finally awake. A knock on the door interrupted the pair's pleasant silence, the small doorknob twisting briefly before a fairly built, middle-aged man made his way into the room, a doctor's coat around his shoulders, and a small clipboard in hand. "You're awake," he smiled. "That's very good." His amicable smile put the pair at ease, even as it began to fade, as he flipped through the small clipboard in his hands. "Now, as glad as I am to see you up and about, I do have to brief you on your injuries." From the way his mother's smile faded, he guessed she'd already been told. "Your most extensive injury is," the doctor waved his hand, moving it towards Izuku's cast-wrapped appendage, "your arm." He cleared his throat before going through the small list. "We had to administer a quirk suppression serum to be able to treat it, and once that was done, we saw just how damaging using your quirk was to your body." He saw the doctor's brows raise just a bit before he began speaking once again. "Your radius and ulna have been snapped in multiple spots near the center, and the recoil of using your quirk has caused microfractures over the rest of the bones." He read a bit further before continuing. "Your humerus also suffered a plethora of microfractures, and your shoulder had been knocked clean out of its socket. Your skull had a few minor fractures too." He raised his gaze from the clipboard, starting over Izuku's prone form. "Young man, you're very lucky that you didn't sustain any spinal injuries." The green-haired boy let out a sigh he didn't know he had been holding in. If that had happened to God, he would have probably been bound to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. "With that all being said, you should be fine. But please, do not use your quirk like that ever again. Just because you got relatively lucky this time, doesn't mean you'll be quite so fortunate the next." Izuku suddenly found the blanket very interesting, as he was unable to meet the doctor's gaze. "For your mother's sake," the doctor added with a soft tone, "I'll notify the nurse that you're awake, you must be starving." After Izuku nodded, the doctor excused himself, and quickly slipped out of the room. Silence descended on the mother and son pair once more, but Izuku was quick to break it. "Is Kaken okay?" Much to his delight, she gave a small nod. Even if he had gotten as busted up as he had, he was still glad that he had saved his best friend of many years. After a small moment, his mother peeked up, suddenly remembering something. "Oh," she exclaimed, startling Izuku. She reached for her purse, rummaging through it for a few seconds. "All Might left you this." His heart began racing at the prospect of what All Might would have left him. An autograph? A poster? An autograph poster? Wait, what was that beeping? Oh, it was the heart monitor. He was getting way too excited. Much to his surprise though, his mother pulled out what seemed to be a small envelope containing a letter. "Well," he mused inwardly, "it certainly isn't a poster." She leaned over, and gently placed the letter in Izuku's lap. He reached for it, his bones creaking in protest, as he lightly gripped the letter. He brought it to his lips, and used his teeth to tear a hole in the side of the envelope. It took him a moment to shake the letter out, and his mother watched on inquisitively, as he carefully unfolded it, and began to read. It was short, and simple. Nonetheless, his eyes still scanned over it obsessively, taking in every detail of his hero's handwriting. The lettering was large, and the spaces between the letters were even larger. Fittingly, All Might had written out the letter in English, and amusingly enough, he wrote everything in capital letters. It was fitting, that loud, confident booming voice echoing in his head, as he read the letter. "Young Midoriya, I wish to talk to you in person. We have something important to discuss about both our futures. All Might." Right beneath his signature was a hastily scrawled out number. Izuku nearly had an aneurysm, again. All Might wanted to talk to him. What for? What could possibly be so important that he couldn't simply write it in the letter? Most importantly, however, he had All Might's number. Mumbling, his mother's voice halted his hushed speaking. The teen gave him an apologetic glance. She returned his gaze with the same expression. She didn't like to do it, but he had requested her to stop him whenever he started that habit of his. He sighed. He really could never get rid of that habit. With Katsuki, the blonde felt frustration shooting through his veins, his head throbbing painfully. All these years of training, all those countless hours slaving away training his quirk, were they all for nothing? He gnashed his teeth together, eyebrows knitting, as he raised his hands up towards his face. He glared at his palms, his irises floating over each and every scar and burn mark that littered his heavily calloused hands. The largest one was at the very center of his right palm. It was the first one he had ever gotten, in fact, from his first use of the quirk. Over time, the large burn marks and the circular scars began to narrow, drawing to a finer point, as he gained more precise control with his quirk, and his skin toughened, only scarring at the very center of where he set off his large explosion. His skin, which was once tender and soft, was now rough and calloused, having thickened considerably from the extensive training he had put his quirk through. He had told Izuku that his quirk was nearly perfect, and that was true. His quirk was damn near perfect. It was powerful, both in an offensive sense, since it could be used for large-scale attacks, and a supplementary sense, since he could use his explosions to shoot himself over large gaps. His quirk was powerful, but he was too weak. His pride stopped him from admitting that to the green-haired boy, but it didn't mean that it wasn't a prevalent fact whenever he tried to use his quirk. For many years, setting off the smallest explosion would result in his hand getting harshly burned, getting covered in blisters. He showed up to school with bandaged hands more often than not, but he brushed off his classmates and his teachers' concerns, simply grinning through the pain. The only reason he was able to use it without the threat of a third-degree burn was because he trained his hands almost religiously. He used to dunk them in boiling water, so he could get used to the blistering temperatures. He set off explosions hot enough to make tears stream down his face, but it was all to toughen his skin, and he had succeeded in doing so. But in the wave of that success, he discovered another weakness in himself. His body couldn't handle the recoil. Small explosions would send his arms flying back, and large explosions were so powerful that they had popped his shoulders clear out of their socket on more than one occasion. Activating his quirk was easy. He could oxidize his sweat and cause explosions in the blink of an eye. Training his body wasn't so easy. It was a long and arduous task, but one that had paid off. Sure, his quirk seemed strong and simple to use to an outsider, but they didn't know how many times he had bit on the inside of his cheek to stop himself from screaming in pain from the searing heat of setting it off. Just when he felt confident, just when he got to a point he could proudly and truthfully say he was strong, he felt weak all over again. He was too weak to stop the villain. He wasn't fast enough to avoid him, nor was he strong enough to blast him, and the thought of that made his blood boil. The fact that his best friend, a brother to him, had landed in the hospital due to his own inability to act was unacceptable. Deku had been in the hospital for 3 days, unconscious. He was told time and time again that the most important quality of being a hero was the spirit of self-sacrifice. Deku, however, took that idea and blew it way out of proportion. Damn it! He felt the edge of his vision begin to cloud, and he felt a slight stinging in his eyes. Freaking hell, was he crying? He let out a yell of frustration and slammed a callous fist against the closest wall, cursing loudly once the pain shot through his arm. Just as the blonde was about to let out a string of curses, the door to his room swung open, and his mother stood in the doorway, looking pleased with herself. "The freak you want, old Hag." His voice cracked, and he was pretty sure a few tears were now cascading down his cheeks, even as he glared at her. Mitsuki's gaze softened as she stared at him. "Izuku?" she asked softly. "So," he yelled back, using the back of his hand to wipe the tears from his eyes. "I was worried too." "Wait, was? The freak did that mean?" "He's awake," she sang, holding up a hand, showing him the keys that were dangling from her pinky. "Get changed, freak face. Visiting hours are almost over." The green-haired woman turned to the 2 young men, who seemed to currently be having a staring match. She opened her mouth to speak, but a dismissive wave from the blonde's mother quickly made her stop. The air between them was so thick with tension that a blunted butter knife could have sliced its way down the middle, each swallowing nervously every few seconds, but not breaking eye contact. She broke her gaze away from the 2 boys and quickly returned to chatting with Mitsuki. Izuku had stayed silent ever since Katsuki entered, and the blonde had been equally as quiet. Thanks. Katsuki finally broke the silence. The green-haired boy was quick to respond with a small nod. "Sorry," Izuku muttered apologetically. "You better be, you little shit." Katsuki's eyebrow twitched before the blonde sighed deeply. "I'm sorry too." An incredulous scoff left his friend's lips. "Did the great Katsuki-sama just apologize to me? Freak you, nerd." Izuku started laughing softly, although a sudden pain in his chest cut him off midway, as he wheezed. "Don't do that shit again," Katsuki commanded angrily. "I didn't need you to end up in the hospital because of me." Izuku softly shrugged. "You'd have done the same had I been in that situation." The blonde huffed in anger, but nodded nevertheless, and the 2 exchanged a slow fist bump. The 2 weeks he had spent in the hospital after that were admittedly very boring. His mother made sure to pop in during visiting hours, often spending most, if not all that time just looking after and feeding him. Katsuki made his presence known daily, as well, bringing him all his notes and making sure that the green-haired boy didn't get lost when it came to their studies. The explosive teen was a better tutor than he liked to admit, even though he complained about it cutting into his training time. Part of him still didn't believe that the blonde trained. Izuku was convinced that he was simply that gifted and good. He had even worked up the nerve to text All Might. That had taken a few days, but he had managed to text out a simple "I'm awake" to his lifelong hero. He nearly had an aneurysm for the third time when All Might replied with a thumbs up, and told him that he wanted to meet with him in person. The two exchanged messages daily after that. It was mostly All Might worriedly asking about his recovery, and making sure that he was eating enough, and things of that nature. It was unusual to have somebody worry about him almost as much as his mother did, but he did really appreciate the gesture. The man was also really eager to meet him, for some reason that escaped him. But finally, after 2 painfully long weeks, he was now taking slow, but confident steps outside of the hospital, his mother holding his uninjured hand in a death grip, making sure that he could put his weight onto her should the extra support be needed. Only once he had stepped out the front door, he realized just how much he missed fresh air and direct sunlight. He took a deep breath, sighing happily, as he allowed his mother to guide him to the car. He idly pulled out his phone, smiling to himself, as he saw the All Might lock screen. He quickly opened up the contact that he had saved All Might's number in. Out of the hospital, he texted slowly. Using a single hand to text was hard. All Might's reply was snappy, as usual. Wonderful, being typed out in bold capital letters. Meet me tonight at Takoba Beach, 8 p.m. It is of utmost importance. His mother was sure to have a fit, knowing he was going out the same day he left the hospital. The scene replayed over and over in his head, like a mantra. The green-haired young man had sprinted in, the look of panic crystal clear on his face, but his feet had still moved. Midoriya had acted when the heroes around him failed to do so, when he failed to do so. Midoriya's plan had been reckless, completely based on the assumption that the villain's eyes were a weak point, and luckily for him, they had been. Having bought himself a bit of time, he momentarily managed to free the blonde hostage. Granted, only his mouth had been released from its slimy confines, but those few milliseconds had been enough for him to suck some much-needed air into his lungs. It was the visage of the green-haired boy's quirk that had shaken him the most, that which had prevented him from acting as quick as he needed to. Its visage had filled him with fear, much like it had years ago. There were a handful of things that made the Toshinori Yagi quake with fear, and that damned quirk was one. He remembered its name, as clear as day. Transmutation. The ability to transmute your own body into whatever you desired. That villain swords, his monologue had been etched into his memory, as if chiseled into stone. He had made sure to explain the quirk thoroughly, laughing, as he did while toying with his victims. He had also done it the last time they fought, just before he had used the quirk's terrifying powers, enhanced with a few other quirks, to tear a hole through his abdomen. He had been sure that it was going to be the last time he was going to see that damned power, the very one that had also taken his adoptive mother's life. He was sure that with his last fight with that man, he had destroyed every remaining trace of the quirk that had haunted his memories. But no, that quirk was still very well alive, and it was flowing through Midoriya Izuku's veins, while the boy clearly wasn't as experienced with its use as his father was. The transmutation process was the same. That faint glow, and the limbs reconfiguring, the metallic bits creaking, as they snapped in place, it was all the same. His brows furrowed, and his teeth gnashed together. He wasn't even sure if that man was actually his father, but the similarities were certainly there. Those sharp, green eyes and that curly, wild hair, they were a bit different, and yet, so frighteningly identical at the same time. Perhaps it was a reach for him to assume that, even unfair to the boy, but he was nearly sure that Midoriya Izuku was somehow related to one of the most frightening villains that had ever lived, all for one. But that left the bigger question unanswered. If he was truly that man's son, then how come he didn't inherit All for One? Had he even inherited it? Had he inherited all the quirks that All for One had? That was a terrifying prospect. That was why he was so incessant when it came to meeting the boy. He simply needed to know. The way that he had spoken about his father seemed to indicate that he didn't even know who he was, which honestly wasn't at all out of character for a sociopath like All for One. Had he decided to have a family before getting bored and abandoning them? If that was the case, then he had a chance, and more than enough reason to step in and show the young boy the righteous path. He could set him on the road to becoming a true hero. He already wanted to be one, but someone his age could still be swayed with ease given the right circumstances. Whether he was the son of a villain or a hero, weak or powerful, young Midoriya was still a child, a highly impressionable child. If a villain managed to sink their claws into the boy, that would spell disaster. A boy with that much power at such a young age would be a frightening villain to face at a later date. The last thing that this society needed was another villain of that man's vast power and intelligence, especially when Toshinori was so close to running out of time. He wasn't even sure if this was a good idea, to train a random child just because he thought was related to his greatest enemy? It wasn't the brightest idea, even in his own head, but the risk was too great. If, by some ungodly chance, he was related to All for One, he couldn't risk that boy growing up to be like him. It was, the 100th time he had this conversation in his head, but still, unease permeated his being, and pulled up in his chest. Of course, he dared not show his hesitancy to anyone, certainly not the young boy. He would still have to, as Recovery Girl liked to say, play the oath. He sighed. Midoriya Izuku was going to be his student, not only for his sake, but for the sake of society, as a whole. Honestly, he hadn't known what to expect when he was asked to show up at Takoba Beach, but he definitely hadn't expected this. All Might, in his lanky, ghastly form, was found sitting on a disassembled car chair that rested atop a pile of trash. He had been sitting with his arms knitted together, his chin resting atop the small cradle he had created. His demeanor, which seemed oddly nervous, instantly shifted the moment those bright blue eyes caught sight of him. He gave him a bright, brimming smile, and in an instant, the thin, deathly-looking man transformed into the god among heroes that was known as All Might. He struck a pose, each hand moving to nestle themselves against his massive waist. Young Midoriya, his booming voice was loud enough to reverberate in Izuku's chest. Please, the hero began, and used one of his massive arms to casually lift up a discarded refrigerator that was sitting atop a small pile of metal scrap. With no effort at all Might hefted the fridge with a single hand, and then promptly placed it on its side, pointing to it afterward. Have a CGUH. Before he even got to finish his sentence, he had coughed up a glob of blood, and deflated, the crimson liquid pooling onto his skin. I really should stop doing this, the man spoke, before letting out a few wheezing breaths and sliding onto the fridge that he had just placed between himself and the young, green-haired man. Izuku could feel the proverbial sweat drops slide down the side of his face at the sight of the deep indentations All Might's fingers had left in the metal. His power was absolutely insane. He made himself comfortable on the refrigerator right beside his idol, his heart thumping nervously in his chest. The tall man turned to him, and Izuku let out a small breath to calm himself. Even in his deflated form, the man stood well over 7 feet tall. His stature was very impressive, and while Izuku was no slouch either, now standing at approximately 6 feet, the man still towered over him. That thoughtful expression made him even more nervous. All Might parted his lips to speak, but before he could do so, the young man interrupted. Why? He cursed his nervous stutter. What? The older man questioned. Why did you want to meet me in person, All Might? Well, as I said, young Midoriya, it's something important regarding both our futures. He suddenly waved a hand dismissively. And please, while I'm in this form, I'm Toshinori Yagi. Please refer to me as such to avoid any blunders while in public. The nature of my quirk is supposed to be a secret, after all. Izuku gave a silent nod, and Toshinori continued. I came here because I have a proposition for you. Something I couldn't explicitly say in a letter. Ah, how would you like to be my student, and train under me? Izuku's brain short-circuited. Why? Came his intelligent, not to mention incredulous, reply. Toshinori smiled, and placed a gentle hand on Izuku's shoulder. Because I see potential in you, my boy. Most great heroes have tales of heroics from their high school days, but do you know what all those stories have in common? He paused for dramatic effect. All of them moved before they could even think. But you went a step beyond. You willingly put yourself in harm's way to rescue a civilian, and that is the most important trait of a hero, the spirit of self-sacrifice. As heroes, we put our lives at risk every single day to rescue other people, and to put a stop to villainous activity. He knew his actions had been reckless, that it would have been wiser to simply wait for a hero with a more suitable quirk to rescue his friend, but he couldn't simply have stayed still while his friend nearly died. Toshinori flexed a thin hand. You were powerful enough to blow that villain away, but from the looks of it, you weren't used to handling such raw power. He waved towards his broken arm, and Izuku let out a nervous chuckle before nodding. All Might flexed an arm, which looked a bit silly in his deflated form, and gave him a grin. My quirk is the same. It gives me unimaginable power, but my body needs to be strong enough to handle the recoil. Izuku stuttered out, and All Might paused. Your quirk, he muttered under his breath. You have one for all, right? Toshinori choked once again, hacking up excessive amounts of blood, as he coughed. His expression became deathly still, and he turned to Izuku, an intense look in his eyes. How do you know about that? His words had an icy tint to them, and a shiver ran up the teen's spine. My father, he burst out. He had a small library, and he wrote a lot of books about quirks. That still didn't explain how his father knew about One for All. All Might ground his teeth together, having his suspicions all, but confirmed about the boy being All for One's child. What do you know about One for All? Toshinori eyed him curiously. Well, I know that it's just a quirk that allows you to stockpile energy, or power, and then transfer it over to another user. That was the basic gist of it, from what he remembered from his father's writing. Toshinori nodded in confirmation. Is that all? Izuku shook his head, and continued, it's an enhancement-type quirk that allows the user to channel that excess energy stored into different parts of their body. If it's the muscles, it makes them stronger. If it's the skin, it can harden it. And if it's channeled through something else, like a quirk, then it increases its maximum output exponentially. He was summarizing and paraphrasing the heavy details that his father had listed. He couldn't simply start listing off the different ways that it had manifested in all the different users like his father had. His father, he noticed, didn't seem very interested in the people who'd owned the quirks, which was very much unlike Izuku, who was obsessed with heroes. He was simply interested in the quirks themselves. He listed off the ways that a quirk could be used, and even went as far as to mention how other quirks could be combined with it. That was an interesting subject that he couldn't even begin to fathom, combining quirks together. Perhaps his father was a strategist of some sort? In the case of One for All, it had been a bit different. His father had devoted 8 sections to each manifestation, as he called it. He had written on it extensively, noting that the power did indeed seem to get stronger with each time it was passed on. He didn't write out any names, simply listing each user as manifestation, and prefixing it with a number. The power started meager at first, a small energy boost, and a slight increase in stamina, before growing with each person that had inherited it. By the time it had gotten to its 8th manifestation, the quirk had turned from a meager boost into overwhelming brute strength in his father's words. The way he described it being used sounded very similar to his favorite hero's quirk. The power to level buildings with a single punch, enhance speed, and durability. It seemed to fit All Might perfectly, said Pro Hero cleared his throat. Oops, was he mumbling again? That's not a bad way of putting it, my boy, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't go around sharing that knowledge publicly. My quirk is a massive secret, known only to a carefully selected handful of people. Toshinori sighed. And now you, as well. Izuku nodded wordlessly. Do you know who your father is? All Might questioned. Izuku shook his head. I don't really remember him, and I don't think I want to either. He added the last part bitterly. My mother said he's in a coma, having lost against the hero in some big fight. His hands tightened to a fist, and his teeth began to grind together. Izuku didn't like speaking about the man. Just the thought of him made his blood boil. When was that? All Might asked, a suspicious tone in his voice. He paused briefly. 5 years ago. Toshinori ran a hand across his shirt, gripping the massive puncture scar that lay beneath. It was around the same time that he had gotten his injury. My boy, the blonde began. I think I might have an idea as to who your father is. Izuku's head snapped towards him. You do? Curiosity was palpable in his green eyes, but seeing All Might's serious demeanor made his expression sober quite a bit. Toshinori let out a heavy sigh, strong enough to rack his frame, as he composed himself. I pray that this isn't true, but all the evidence seems fitting. Izuku leaned in closer. You two look alike, have the same quirk, and your father is a villain, who got into a coma around the same time I got my injury. Conveniently, you don't know what he looks like, but the fact that he has information on my quirk is more than enough evidence for me. He sighed deeply again. It might not be my place to say this, but you, out of everyone, have the right to know. I have reasons to believe that your father is a villain that I had previously faced. He was also one of the greatest villains, if not the greatest villain to have ever lived. He wasn't about to just drop that on the young boy though. Not that it matters anymore, he uttered. He is in a coma, as you said. He was lying through his teeth, and Toshinori knew it. All for One was very much alive, and active, although he was making his presence scarce. Even he, out of all people, was having trouble getting much news about him. Quickly switching the subject, All Might stood to his feet, quickly inflating to his muscle form, as he stared at his young, soon-to-be pupil. Back to the task at hand, his voice boomed out once again. So how about it, young man? Will you be my student? The second question, which echoed loudly in All Might's head, remained unspoken. Will you prove yourself worthy to be my successor? It had taken nearly a month, but finally Izuku felt confident enough to say he was back to competent quirk usage in the arm he had injured. Having taken off the cast 2 weeks prior, against the doctor's advice, he'd begun training his quirk immediately after. He had combined rehabilitation with quirk practice. While he flexed his arm and wrist, he'd transmute random patches of his skin into metal. He needed to be sure he had the precise control needed to perform his complex transmutations before he actively pursued them. After all, it was one of his complex transmutations that had caused him to be in such a predicament in the first place. Today, he had finally managed to pass his self-created test. He'd hold his arms up and go through a set of transmutations in a row. Before the first was finished, he'd begin the second one. To an outsider, it would look like his arms contained a strobe light, constantly shifting between different hues of metal. It was simple in theory, but hard in practice, especially since his previously injured arm seemed to be a tad bit slower than his left. He had assumed it was a permanent effect of him practically blowing his arm off, but thankfully, with a few hours of rigorous training, he had managed to get his transmutations up to speed again. Being as eager as he was to prove his worth to All Might, he had asked to meet the moment he had achieved a result he was satisfied with. And now, here he was, standing on the dirty shore of Takoba Beach, and there was All Might flexing his muscles in a ridiculous pose atop a pile of scrap metal. A brief look of recognition flashed in All Might's eyes as he saw Izuku's form, but the man didn't react, he simply kept his pose. Izuku let out a sigh. The top hero always had a flair for the dramatic. So he began, "Why are we here again?" "Because, young man, this," All Might threw his arms out, pointing to the area around them, "is your training." "What?" His answer was a loud, boisterous laugh, and Izuku couldn't help but grin along, if about shakily. His enthusiasm and confidence were really infectious. "You're going to use your quirk to clear this beach, and while you do so, I will supervise and be drilling you on the basics of becoming a hero." Izuku blanked as he glanced at the area around him. Mountains of garbage and small heaps of metal covered practically every inch of the beach. Was All Might really expecting him to clear this entire beach? "You have BLURGH. The hero violently coughed into his hand, blood seeping out past his lips. He cleared his throat before raising 2 hands up, each holding up 3 fingers. 6 months, he croaked out hoarsely, his voice always strained after one of his coughing bouts. 6 months? That didn't sound bad at all. Hell, he was sure he could clear it in a half that time. Not being one to pointlessly dally, Izuku's hands began to glow, and much to All Might's fascination, Izuku's ears started to give off a dim glow too. His hands and ears began transmuting rapidly, the transmutation on his hands actually being fairly simple, but his ears were another story entirely. He remembered spending weeks disassembling speakers, microphones, and all sorts of acoustic equipment to manage to get the right balance needed to turn his ears into what was basically an ultra-sensitive sonar. It had taken a minute, but eventually, his right hand had taken the shape of a black metal rod with a thick sphere at the very end, and his other hand had taken the form of a flat board, its color an onyx black. He held out the metallic board, and then slammed the rod against it, resulting in a sharp clang. He saw All Might uncomfortably shift in place. As he did, the loud sound causing his ears to ring painfully. The teen closed his eyes as he proceeded to slam the hammer against the anvil. He did this about a dozen times, each strike coming harsher than the one before. He kept his eyes closed for a few moments after stopping, his hands giving a dim glow before returning to their normal form. A moment later, his ears also shone for a few seconds as he finally opened his eyes. All Might was staring at him expectantly, a curious expression on his face. The question was unasked, but it hung clearly in the air. Izuku was quick to elaborate, a sheepish smile creeping on his lips. "Sorry," he chuckled. "I wanted to map the place out, and I thought this was the fastest way to do it." The confused expression didn't fade from the hero's face, and for good reason. To him, all Izuku did was smack 2 strange-looking metallic pieces against one another. "You know how bats use sound waves for echolocation?" All Might gave a hesitant nod. "It was sort of like that. I transmuted my ears so they'd be able to pick up the echoes that bounced off of anything solid on the beach." All Might's brows raised, not from confusion but rather from surprise. "You know how to do that with your quirk?" the blonde asked, all clear in his tone. Izuku gave a brief nod, grinning in response. "And a lot more." This time, it was All Might who mirrored his grin. Training young Izuku would prove to be very interesting. Toshinori Yagi had to admit, he was impressed, very impressed. Day by day, he watched as Izuku cleared out piles upon piles of garbage from Takoba Beach, and slowly, the once popular location was returning to its former glory. He had a good amount of strength. While the green-haired young man certainly had the build of an athlete, All Might hadn't expected that his lean muscles could put out much lifting power. Glad to have been proven wrong, he could lug around dozens of kilograms like they were nothing, and Toshinori could only assume it was training that was somehow related to his quirk. After all, a quirk like his required a certain amount of physical prowess. One couldn't simply transform his arms into dense metal without the muscle mass needed to lift and use said arms. What was more impressive, however, was how versatile his quirk seemed to be. He watched dozens of times, as Izuku had used some transmutation to hoist up a stubborn piece of metal, or the time he had broken down an entire scrap car using nothing more than a crowbar and a hammer. That had been an interesting sight to see. And on certain days when Midoriya was especially eager to please, he'd get up and make small items disappear into his hands, and either turn them to dust or oxygen. Apparently, he could transmute small items, but didn't do it often because it put too much of a dent in his reserves. And now, on the 85th day mark, he came to see the beach completely cleared, Izuku standing proudly atop a filled moving truck, a smug expression on his face. almost as if his face was carrying a sentiment of "I told you I could do it." He had been so excited that he had immediately inflated into his muscle form, hands slapping against one another in an excited applause. Almost playfully, he saw Izuku bow, bending a hand beneath his abdomen. As he did so, the pair shared a laugh afterwards, and the green-haired teen jumped down from his position on the small heap of scrap. The blonde saw excitement in his eyes, an eagerness to prove himself once again to his hero. Toshinori had to admit, he loved how unrelenting Izuku's enthusiasm was. In a way, it reminded the man of himself. He laid a hand on his shoulders, giving the boy a beaming smile. The pair stood, unmoving for a few moments in a comforting silence. It was eventually Izuku who broke it, however. "So," he said with a big grin, "what's next, sensei?" His response came in the form of All Might's trademarked boisterous laugh, a muscled hand moving to the blonde spikes that rested atop his head, and then proceeded to pluck out a single strand of hair. "Young man," he started, "I have to say, not only did you pass my test, you did it in half of the expected time. It's rare that I'm ever impressed, but you have exceeded all my expectations. This test wasn't simply to see if you were worthy to become my student, but also to see if you were worthy of becoming my successor. Now, I pass on to you this sacred torch, cultivated by generations. You are worthy of inheriting one for all." He extended the hair out, holding it for Izuku to grab. "Now eat this." Izuku swallowed nervously. He knew that one for all was passed on by the transfer of DNA, but still, All Might asking him to swallow one of his hairs was just weird. But he had, and now, the number one hero was staring at him proudly. It was strange, and the weight of what happened hadn't fully settled into his head quite yet. He was now the 9th user of One for All, so why exactly didn't he feel any different? Sensing his confusion, the now deflated Toshinori laughed. "Your body has to digest it before you feel anything, my boy." "Oh, that makes sense." He nearly face-palmed. Of course, it sounded so obvious now that All Might had said it. "Now what?" he muttered, staring at Toshinori expectantly. The man flashed him a kind smile. "For today you rest. We need to get One for All fully integrated into your system before we do any active training again." Izuku gave a small nod. "Hey, All Might." Toshinori shook his head, raising a hand up. "What did I tell you, young Midoriya? When I'm in this form, please refer to me as Yagi." His student had the decency to blush. The man had repeated that dozens of times over their 2 months of training, but it still didn't feel natural to him to refer to his hero by first-name basis. "Hey, Yagi-san?" The man gave an approving nod, and a thumbs up. "Would you like to have dinner with my mother, and I after training tomorrow?" Izuku saw a very unusual sight. It was All Might, blushing, and frantically waving his arms about. "I dash," and the green-haired teen thought he had a stuttering problem. "I wouldn't want to intrude." Izuku tossed him a bright smile. "Nonsense, we'll be more than glad to have you." Yagi gave a sheepish smile, scratching the back of his head. "I don't see why not." Izuku's smile brightened upon his agreement. "Great, I'll see you tomorrow?" The blonde nodded. Tomorrow. Izuku had to admit, he didn't feel much different, even long after he had, reluctantly, consumed the hair that All Might had given him. Just a general sense of unease, but perhaps that was more due to his nerves than his body going through an actual change, as it absorbed the quirk. He had just settled into bed, resting his head against a rather fluffy pillow before he suddenly started feeling something. Like a strong surge of heat that was flowing through his veins. It was a pleasant warmth at first, his blood warming within his veins. Then it became slightly stronger, hotter, until it became unbearable, and felt as if molten lava was flowing through his vascular system. Similarly, his chest felt hot, like somebody had sunk a red-hot brand against his skin. He wanted to grab hold of the blankets and rip them off his frame. Maybe that would alleviate some of the overwhelming heat, but he couldn't. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He attempted to move a finger, a foot, anything, but his body wouldn't respond. It was a frightening feeling, almost as if he was trapped inside his own body, unable to control it, but still able to feel everything that was occurring to him. He could move his eyes and look around, but not much more. His body suddenly seized, and he began to convulse. The movement was so violent that it had sent him barreling off the side of the bed and onto the floor, landing with a heavy thump. His pain only seemed to worsen with the impact. His arms began glowing, the telltale sign of a transmutation, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen before. While his arms were a metallic hue that he was familiar with, it was divided, marred. The spots in his arms where his veins would be located had simply refused to transmute. Fear coursed throughout his system, as they suddenly gave off a dim, red glow. The dim light didn't last long, as his veins now began to glow a radiant, crimson red, the throbbing pain only getting worse in tandem with their brightness. He laid there frozen, for what seemed like hours, as his veins pulsated, the heat getting worse, and worse before suddenly, the color of those vein-like markings on his arms changed, turning a faint orange, and then suddenly, a glowing green. He saw what he swore were arcs of electricity flowing around his arms, curling, and twisting around the appendage, their hue a similar color to the lines on his arms. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The pain, the burning, it all stopped. He watched in silence, as that metallic silver that had consumed his arm began to slowly unravel, unwinding from his fingertips at first, and then slowly running up his arm. It looked like the transmutation itself was being drawn to those glowing veins, and once the metal had faded from his skin, the light show did, as well. His body suddenly felt as if a weight had been dropped on it. He felt tired. I'm so tired. So much that he couldn't help but let unconsciousness overtake him, his eyes fluttering shut, and his head lying limply onto the floor. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.